The farmers markets are absolutely packed with fresh produce this time of year, especially sweet corn. So to do something a little bit unique with sweet corn, I took a few ears of corn home with me and I made this amazing roasted sweet corn sourdough bread. At the end of this video, I'll show you the best way to enjoy it. I started by boiling a few ears of corn. I boiled 6 of them, but you'd probably only need about 2 or 3 for this recipe. And then after I boiled them, I roasted them over an open flame to get some char on the outside of the corn. With the corn roasted to my liking, I let them rest on a wire rack for about an hour until they were cooled. Then I cut the corn as clean as I could off the cob until it looked like this. Then I weighed out 150 grams of sweet corn, which you'll need for this 1 loaf recipe. Like I said, you'll only need 2 or 3 ears of corn for this, not 6. I definitely had some left over, but that's okay. Setting the sweet corn aside for later, I'm ready to make this dough. Start by adding 300 grams of water to a mixing bowl. This is going to be a 70% hydration sourdough bread recipe, just like my standard sourdough bread, but I'm going to be folding in the corn during the stretch and fold process. After the water, add 10 grams of salt. Kosher salt or sea salt will work fine for this. And then after the salt, add 100 grams of active sourdough starter. This starter I fed the night before and it was ready to use by the morning. 100 grams of starter goes into the mixing bowl, and then the remaining starter can go back into the fridge for the next time you want to bake. Stir everything together thoroughly with a spoon to dissolve the starter and salt into the water. Then add 450 grams of bread flour to the wet mixture. I'm using King Arthur brand bread flour, the one in the blue bag. It's 12.7% protein, if you're wondering about that. Then stir everything together until a rough dough is formed. You can do this part with your hands or with a wooden spoon or a metal spoon, whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. You're mixing until almost all of the dry flour disappears into the water and the dough looks something like this. At this point, cover up the dough with a kitchen towel and let it rest for 30 minutes at room temperature. A half hour later, it's time to perform the first set of stretch and folds. You're not going to be incorporating the corn just yet. You want to build a little bit of gluten development in the dough before you do that. So grab an edge of the dough and stretch it up into the air as far as you can without it really ripping too much, then fold it over the top of the dough. Give the bowl a quarter turn, grab the next edge, stretch it up, and fold it over the top. Another quarter turn, stretch the dough up, and fold it over the top. And then one last quarter turn, give the dough one last stretch up in the air, and fold it over the top of the dough. That's the first set of stretch and folds. Go ahead and cover the dough up with a kitchen towel and let it rest for another half hour. 30 minutes later, it's time for the next set of stretch and folds. You're going to be doing 2 more sets of stretch and folds, and you're going to be incorporating the corn during each set. So here's how to do that. Start by running your hand under some water so you don't stick to the dough as much, and then just dimple down the dough a little bit with your fingertips. You're just flattening the dough a little bit to prepare to put the corn on top. And then you're going to put half of that corn mixture directly on top of the dough. You're going to be incorporating 1/2 of the mixture now, and then 1/2 of the mixture later during the next set of stretch and folds. This might seem like a lot of corn, but it will incorporate fairly easily into this dough. Press down the corn into the dough a little bit with your fingertips to get it to stick. And then just perform another set of stretch and folds like you did the first time. This time you're going to be folding the corn into the dough in layers with each fold that you do. So fold the first corner, the second corner, stretch it up and fold it over. The third corner, stretch it up and fold it over again. And then the final corner, stretch it up and fold it over the top. Cover up the dough with a kitchen towel for another 30-minute rest. Then a half hour later, do the same thing you did the last time. Add half of the corn mixture, the remaining corn on top of the dough. Then give it 4 stretches and folds. Fold number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now all of that corn is incorporated inside of your dough in layers. Cover the dough up for another 30-minute rest. After this half-hour rest, I like to flip the dough out of the bowl onto the counter with the seam side facing down and what is typically the smoother side facing up. What I'm going to do here is just kind of cup and pull the dough to form a tighter ball. I want a tighter ball of dough during the bulk fermentation so that the dough can rise upward in a uniform shape. So cup and pull the dough with your hands a few times or with a bench scraper until you get a tight ball of dough that looks something like this. Then pick up the dough and transfer it carefully back into the same mixing bowl with the smooth side facing up and the seam side facing down. Then cover the dough up and let it bulk ferment at room temperature on the counter for about 3 to 5 more hours until the dough is roughly doubled in size like this. Mine took about 4 more hours until it was doubled. Now to pre-shape your dough, put it on the counter with the seam side facing down and the smooth side facing up. Then go around the dough a few times with your hands, shaping the dough into a ball. Let it rest on the counter uncovered for a half hour, and then come back for the final shape. Now it's time to give this dough its final shape as an oval, so sprinkle some flour on top of the dough, and then flip it over so the floured side is against the counter and the sticky side is facing up. If you lose any corn pieces in this process, just go ahead and put them back into the sticky side of the dough, and that's where they'll stay. Now gently pull the dough into a rectangle or a square shape, and then you're going to take 1/3 of the dough and fold it over the middle third. Then take the other end of the dough and fold it over the middle third as well. Now you've got this long log of dough, but we're going to do one more thing to build some tension. So take one end of the dough and then just start rolling the dough into itself like this, moving towards yourself until you've got a nice tight loaf like this. And again, if any corn pops out of the top, you can stick that onto the bottom side where it's a little more sticky. Then to round out the edges, for this one I just kind of did this with my hands, giving a little bit of pressure. It seemed to be enough to round out the edges of the dough. Got my well-floured banneton basket here. I dusted it with some regular bread flour and also a little bit of cornmeal. You could use either one, whatever works for you. Then transfer the dough upside down into the banneton basket with the seam side facing up. You could move the dough to the fridge right now for a long overnight proof, but I like to cover up the dough for 1 hour, leave it on the counter at room temperature. Then an hour later, it's puffy like this, and it's got a nice head start on fermentation. Then I cover it up with my banneton basket cover, and I move it to the fridge for a long overnight proof, about 8 to 12 hours in the fridge. The next day, whenever you're ready to bake, just take the dough out of the fridge. You can bake it straight from the fridge, cold, that's completely fine. Move the dough onto a piece of parchment paper or a bread peel or a pizza peel like I have here, and then dust off any excess flour that's on top of the dough. At this point, it's time to score the dough. I like to take a razor blade in my bread lame and just give it one long slash across the top of the dough. You could do any kind of intricate score that you want though. And then move this to your hot Dutch oven. This should be preheating to 450 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 30 minutes. Then place the lid of your Dutch oven or Challenger bread pan on top of the base to trap the steam, and let this bake at 450 degrees for 20 minutes with the lid on. 20 minutes after that, it's time to take the lid off and admire the hopeful oven spring. And there it is. This dough opened up really nicely along the score mark, and the bread is showing off all that roasted sweet corn that it's loaded with. Slide the bread back into the oven and keep baking for another 20 minutes with the lid off. 20 minutes later, this loaf had a golden brown color that I was happy with, so I took it out of the oven and put it onto a wire rack. This loaf was a wonderful golden brown with a little extra crispiness on the edges. It even had some gorgeous blistering on the crust as well. Let your dough rest on a wire rack for at least an hour before you slice in. You could notice some gumminess if you slice into your bread too early while the bread is still hot and steamy. I told you earlier I'd show you the best way to eat this loaf of bread, and here it is. I think the texture of the corn really is begging for crunchiness, and the flavor is really just begging to be paired with butter as well. So instead of eating this bread plain like you might normally do with sourdough bread, toss a slice of this bread into the toaster or fry it up in a pan with some butter until it's crispy. The crunchy texture pairs perfectly with the little bites of sweet corn, and the toasted bread and roasted sweet corn flavors pair amazingly well with the slather of salted butter added on at the end. To make this roasted sweet corn sourdough bread recipe at home, check out the recipe in the video description. This has been Grant from Grant Bakes, and I will see you in the next video.